Hi there. Welcome back to Tuesday's Tips. I'm Greg Kaiser, and in this weekly YouTube feature, I've been doing a lot of talk about image editing. Here lately, we've been talking about local edits within Lightroom, and I want to stray a little bit from that this time around. And we're going to kind of go with the theme that I did a couple months ago when I talked about maximizing the dynamic range of any camera and how to get the best possible results out of using your histogram. Today I want to talk about an issue that comes up repeatedly. It's a huge marketing gimmick for camera manufacturers, and everybody wants the sharp image. And I'm here to tell you that a sharp image has nothing to do with going out and buying a lot of products. You don't have to buy new cameras. You don't have to buy new lenses. It's not about image stabilization. It's more about technique than anything. So that's what I want to talk about today, and hopefully it's going to benefit you. And if you're having a hard time getting a sharp image, hopefully this is going to be a good starting point for you to improve on your own photography. And before we get too far into it, I want to kind of describe the two types of blur that you are going to see in a photo. Now, the first one is subject motion, and that obviously is motion that your subject is bringing into the image, whether it's, a tree moving in the breeze, a person running through the frame, an animal grazing, water moving through the scene. Sometimes you want to create an image that captures that motion and blurs it, and that is an on-purpose thing. We're not talking about that this time. We're talking about trying to make the sharpest image possible and not showing motion. So for the arguments that we're going to be making today, I don't want to introduce subject motion. So everything I want in my frame, I want sharp and I want still. So that's one type of blur that we're looking at. The other type is going to be camera movement. And again, this is something that can be done on purpose. We've all heard of intentional camera motion or movement, ICM photography, and that's where you are taking a picture and you're shooting handheld, and it's a kind of longish exposure, a second or even more, and you press the button and you do something with the camera and you introduce that motion, and it can create a really cool abstract effect. We're not talking about that intentional camera motion. We are talking about how to get the sharpest image possible without creating that motion, whether it be camera movement or subject movement. So the best thing that we can really look at here that's going to affect both of those things is shutter speed. And that is a good starting point, because if you're looking at subject motion, you can adjust the shutter speed to counter that. If it is an animal grazing, for instance, a cow, if you can get somewhere down around a 20th of a second, you can usually freeze that cow grazing in a field so that you don't get the annoying, sharp body with the blurry head or the swishing tail. Now, if they're moving a little bit more than just a slow graze, you might need to speed up the shutter speed a little bit. If you are photographing a runner, you might need to be somewhere 1/500th of a second or faster, maybe 1,000th of a second. A tree blowing in the wind in just a slight breeze, 1/20th usually will work. If you really want to be sure, 1/200th of a second will usually stop a tree from blowing. That starts to get into, how much depth of field do you want, because you're going to have to adjust aperture, ISO, things like that, but that's another discussion. But those are the kind of things you want to think about with shutter speed when it comes to subject motion. Now, with camera movement, shutter speed is also going to play a part there as well. And we're going to get into more detail with that when we talk about proper hand holding. So just hold off on that for a minute, but just know that shutter speed plays a part with camera motion, because obviously I can't do a 20-second long exposure to get the cloud streaking over a landscape handheld, because I'm going to be moving this camera ever so slightly, not intending to, but it will happen. Shutter speed makes a difference hand holding. Shutter speed makes a difference with subject. So that's the first thing, and that's the one that's kind of common sense. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on that, but I do want to mention it. The next thing, which is kind of relating to shutter speed, is image stabilization or vibration reduction, depending on what kind of camera you are talking about. Here recently, we've seen a lot of camera bodies themselves that are getting in-body image stabilization. This is not one. This is an old D40 or a 40D Canon from way back in the day, my first DSLR. Didn't have in-body image stabilization. That was a decade later on. But we're now seeing a lot of different lenses that have the image stabilization built into the lenses, and that's a technology that's been around for a long time. And a lot of times you will get that combination where the lens and the camera body has image stabilization, and that can sometimes give you 7 to 8 stops or maybe even more in image stabilization. But normally what we're seeing with just the lenses is 2 to 3 stops. That's what most of them are marketed as. And then you get another 4 or 5 stops out of the camera body, which added together will get you those really big numbers, which are kind of impressive. But that's only going to go so far and will only affect camera movement. Has nothing to do at all with subject movement. It is only with the camera movement, which is the movement that is introduced by the photographer and the camera. So that's what image stabilization is there for. It is not a cure-all by any stretch, and I don't want to give you that indication. And what we want to do is get the best possible image in the field, which means it needs to be exposed correctly, it needs to have proper focus, and it needs to be sharp so that when you get it into post-processing, you have the best raw materials to work with. So we're going to really dive into how to make the sharpest image that you can, and it has nothing to do with what glass that you choose to buy. It has nothing to do with the body. These are all very simple techniques, and it's just that. It is techniques that the photographer is going to use. So let's start off talking about dealing with camera movement, because that's what we have control over. Shutter speed is for subject control. No doubt about it, that's the only thing we can really use for subject control. But there's a lot that we can use as photographers to control the movement that we introduce into a photograph. So proper hand holding is the first thing that I want to mention. And that does not mean do the YouTuber special where you've got the camera out here, you're looking at the screen, the arm's outstretched, and you're taking pictures and you're doing all this stuff and yes, yes, yes. No, that's not a stable platform. Number one, if the arm is outstretched, you can see I'm trying to hold it steady, but there is motion in the camera. And that's just going to happen. The longer you shoot, the more motion you're going to see. Your arm is going to get heavy. And again, this is a very old camera with 10 to 22 millimeter lens on it. It's light. Nothing about this is heavy. Modern cameras have gotten heavier. Lenses have gotten heavier. This will get to be very fatiguing after a while, and you will see a lot of motion. So we want to talk about proper hand holding, and I'm going to get up and do a little bit of a demonstration here, so bear with me. Let's see. Okay. There we go. All right, so first thing you want to do is make sure that your feet are about shoulder width apart, and you can set one of them back a little bit further if you want. This is kind of like a shooting stance for those of you that have done target shooting with a pistol. So your body is now a stable platform. We don't want feet together where you're kind of doing this number and you're wobbling all around. Give yourself a firm platform to stand on so that you don't move. Next thing, you want to create 3 points of contact with the camera to this firm platform that you've got going on here. Best way to do that is to hold the camera on the grip side with your right hand, thumb hooked behind here so that you've got a good grip, fingers able to hit that shutter release button. Left hand, you're going to cup the lens so that you've got the ability to manually focus or zoom, whichever you need to do, but you are placing the camera in the palm of your hand and cupping the lens. That gives you 2 points of contact, but they're not connected to anything. So we're going to dig our elbows into our sides. That gives our arms a nice stable platform that is anchored with our feet. And then the last part of this is going to be right here, the eye cup on your viewfinder. It fits really nicely up underneath the eye socket. So you're going to look through the viewfinder like this with your elbows tucked in, the camera placed firmly in the eye socket, and this right here is your 3 points of contact. 1 point of contact, and then with the hands holding the camera, these are your other two, these chicken wings here. They're planted right there. This is planted here. You've got a good solid 3 points of contact. So that gives you a very stable shooting platform. And just in case you didn't see it from the distance, we're talking about the top of the eye cup here, which is actually designed, I think, to fit right here. It's soft and it fits right up here under the eye socket. Now, if you have glasses, that is going to be a problem. I would recommend taking the glasses off, and I wear contacts and I'm blind as a bat without them. I understand the plight of those with glasses, but you can put them up on top of your head, and on pretty much all cameras there's a little dial here. It's a diopter. You can adjust this viewfinder to go with whatever vision you've got. So you would have that ability to get this right here where I'm talking about, even if you wear glasses. And it just makes for a more stable hand-holding platform. Now, we've got a really good stable platform now to shoot with. So I've mentioned shutter speed, and this is where you're going to be able to eke the most out of your shutter speed. And what I mean is, a good rule of thumb is you take the reciprocal of the focal length that you are shooting. So for instance, you've got the Nifty 50, the Plastic Fantastic 50mm lens on a full frame camera. You would take the reciprocal of that focal length, 50. 1/50th becomes the slowest shutter speed that you should be looking for to be able to shoot a sharp handheld image. And if you really want to make it better, double that. So 1/100th of a second would make for eliminating any hand holding shaking. Even with a good firm grip and all that I was talking about, this is a good rule of thumb. 1/50th on the outside, 1/100th to be really safe. Now, if you are shooting on a crop frame sensor camera, and that's one that has a slightly smaller than full frame or 35mm frame of film, then there's a conversion factor involved. So that 50mm lens actually is closer to an 85mm lens on a crop frame camera. So if you're shooting on a crop frame with a 50mm lens, 1/85th of a second or faster is what you're looking at, or let's see, we double that, what, 1/70th or faster, 1/170th of a second or faster. So you see how that's going to come into play. If you're shooting with a crop frame camera, you are going to need that little bit of extra just to make sure that things are nice and stable. So let's look at the image stabilization. What that does is it corrects camera motion. So as that sensor or the optical bits and pieces in the lens sense motion with like a gyroscopic motor, it's going to correct that motion. And the older image stabilized lenses were good for about 2 stops. They're 3 and 4 stops now. The bodies can be up to 5 stops. So what does that mean? Well, going back to full frame camera for simplicity, or using a 50 millimeter lens, let's say 1/50th is what we're aiming for that sharp handheld picture. Well, if we have an old lens that has 2 stops of image stabilization to it, that means that we are going to be able to go from 1/50th of a second down to 1/25th and then 1/10th of a second. So that is slowing that down. That 1/10th actually turns into 1/13th of a second on the third of a stop shutter speeds. So, yeah, I think I got my math wrong, and I apologize. 1/50th to 1/25th would be 1/12th of a second, but that 1/12th actually turns into 1/13th on what you're seeing when you're setting your exposure. So with 2 stops of image stabilization, vibration reduction, with that 50 millimeter lens, you theoretically can safely handhold up to 1/13th of a second, which is a good bit slower than that 1/50th. It's not a cure-all, and again, has nothing to do with subject motion. This is just handheld camera motion. And you have to know your vibration reduction. Don't go with the marketing numbers that they give. Know for sure what you can do, because everybody's different. I've had a lot of students through workshops and mentorships that are very stable, and I've had some that have a lot of shakiness built in. And it's just up to the person, up to the photographer. Some are shakier than others. I'm getting shakier the older I get. I know this, so I have to err on the side of caution when hand holding. So do keep that in mind. But the best way, unless you're shooting portraiture, which works a whole lot better handheld, but the best way, if you're shooting something that's still, to get a sharp image is to use a tripod. And it doesn't just stop there. Tripod works very well on its own, but you really want to do a couple more things with it. And one thing that I want to show is a tripod, and I happen to have one right here. Just for the sake of argument, I like tripods with legs that have no more than 3 sections. I think the video just paused, but I like tripods that have no more than 3 sections, because each one of these join points is a place for vibration to be introduced. I also like carbon fiber. It's light, it's steady, and does not vibrate much. So even here at the full leg extension, this is very stable. It's not going anywhere. Get a good quality ball head, and you are well on your way to having a very solid platform. I'm going to leave that there for now, because I'm probably going to come back to it. So use a tripod, but that's only part of it, because what I see a lot of times in my workshops and different classes that I've taught, okay, there goes my English as a first language. But something that I've seen a lot is people will have neck straps hanging on their camera. If you're shooting on a tripod, take the neck strap off. If you do use a neck strap, use those quick release things like Peak Design has. Those are handy. But if you're primarily tripod like I am in my landscape and decay photography, just take the neck strap off. You don't need it. And having that neck strap hanging down here is going to catch the wind. And it's just going to move, and it may be just enough to introduce vibration into the camera. Completely avoidable. Take that neck strap off, you don't need it. So that's rule number 1 on a tripod. Take the neck strap off. Rule number 2, and I can't stress this one enough because almost everybody forgets this, myself included at times. If you have image stabilization or vibration reduction on your camera, whether it's lens or body, turn that off on a tripod. Let me repeat that one. If you have image stabilization of any sort on your camera, lens, or body, and you are shooting on a tripod, turn it off. The reason for that is these image stabilization features find motion and counter it. That's their whole reason for being. If you have done the right thing and you have a solid tripod, your camera's correctly mounted, and there is no motion, you've removed the neck strap, there is no motion, that image stabilization is going to look for motion. And how it looks is it's going to move the sensor or it's going to move the optics in the lens. It's not a guarantee, but there is a really good chance that it will introduce motion into your picture because it's looking for motion to correct. So just, you don't need it, with the exception of a really, really windy day and shooting with a long lens where the tripod itself can't keep the camera from having vibrations. Maybe you're having to hold the neck of the tripod. Turn the image stabilization on at that point because there is motion for it to find and correct, and it will be effective. But generally speaking, if you're on a tripod, turn that feature off. Now, the next thing that I'm going to recommend only applies to those shooting with a DSLR. My main camera is a DSLR. It's this 5D SR. And I've shot with several different of the 5D models. I love them. But this is a DSLR. Still use it to this day as my primary camera. And one of the features that I do have active on it and use is called mirror lockup. Now what mirror lockup does, and I'm going to show you over here on this dead camera because I don't care if the stuff gets messed up on the inside. There is a mirror right in here on a DSLR, and whatever you're taking pictures of, that image comes through the lens, hits that mirror, comes up to the pentaprism, and then ultimately comes out here on the viewfinder. That's how you can see through the lens, because obviously this is not in line with this. So that's how a DSLR works. Mirrorless does not have that. It just goes straight through to the sensor. But what happens when you press the button, several things mechanically happen in this camera. Number one, the mirror slaps up out of the way. Now there's a lot of moving parts there, and the mirror, while being light, does have a certain amount of mass to it. So as this mirror that's here flops up, it sends vibrations through the camera body. So the way to avoid that is to use a feature called mirror lockup. Depending on your camera, it may be buried in the menu, it may be a button on the outside. From my experience, it's usually in the menus, and it's more readily accessible on the higher end cameras. The cheaper introductory level cameras, it can be buried way far down in the menus because they're not really expecting you to use it. But I found that most every camera has a mirror lockup feature. So what happens is, if you are pressing this shutter button, or we'll talk about this more here in a second, you've got a remote release. The first time you press that button, that mirror slaps up out of the way, creates its vibration, the vibration dissipates. Press that button again on your remote shutter release, preferably. You expose the image. The mirror's out of the way. You don't get that shock from that movement inside the camera. So again, makes for a cleaner, sharper image. Mirrorless cameras, not a concern because they don't have mirrors. If, like me, you shoot in live view a lot on a DSLR, well, guess what? Essentially, it's working like a mirrorless at this point, because to get that live view to work, that mirror has to go from down to up so that the sensor is exposed so that you can see what the camera sees digitally on that LCD on the back. So if you don't want to mess with mirror lockup and you shoot live view anyway, you've solved that problem. Mirrors up out of the way, it's not an issue. Now, the next part, and I already kind of hinted to this, is a remote release, because if you're using this button right here with a mirror lockup, you press the button once, the mirror slaps up, vibrations are gone, everything's great. You hit this button again to take the picture, you're introducing vibration. Not ideal. So I like having a wired remote. It's something that is not going to fail because a signal gets lost or whatever my phone decides to do cell phone things. It just plugs in here to the side. I keep it here. It goes through my L bracket through this little cutout right here, so it doesn't affect how it attaches to the tripod. I can still attach it here, still attach it here. But it allows me to be able to press this button, get it in the light, there we go, right there. It allows me to press that button, so I can press it once, and if I don't have the live view on, it's going to lock the mirror out of the way. Press it again, exposes the picture. If I am using live view, or if you're using a mirrorless, press the button one time and the shutter does its thing. There is no contact with the camera, which means that you don't have any vibration from that, so it works very, very well. If you're using a wired remote or maybe an app on your phone, or a wireless remote or an app on your phone, it's going to work fundamentally the same way. I just don't trust wireless stuff as much as I probably should to use those products. I like the old-fashioned plug it in kind of thing. Now, if you don't have a remote release, don't have the app on your phone, don't have a camera that allows for wireless stuff, no problem. You can still get away with this dirt cheap, like for free. Because if you go into the menu options, or you might have a dedicated button, you've got a self-timer on your camera. And like Canon has a 2-second and a 10-second. I've seen other manufacturers do multiple different ones, a 2, 8, 12, some that you can custom set. Whatever the case may be, use that remote shutter release. So what happens is you press the button and it starts a countdown. The mirror will slap up if you're on a DSLR, so that works well. And it does its little countdown, whether it's 2 seconds, 8 seconds, 10 seconds, whatever, and then without any other input, it's going to take the picture. For the most part, I have found that a 2-second self-timer works just fine, with the exception of when I get into telephoto photography and anything above about 150 millimeter focal length. That 2 seconds is not enough to guarantee that I've got a tack sharp image. So I will bump it up to 10 seconds. And the reason is you have this big long lens sitting on the front of the camera, and it is taking such a small little focal length crop of your scene that any motion at all is amplified. So any vibrations left in this camera are still going to be present with that long lens shot. So 2 seconds after you press the button on a tripod with a heavy lens, there's still going to be a certain amount of vibration that's going to show up in your picture. 10 seconds, while it's excruciatingly long to wait, eliminates those vibrations. But again, that's why I like a remote, because I don't have to worry about what focal length I'm shooting. I just hit the button, I know the camera hasn't been touched, I'm good to go. Also, the scene can change in 2 seconds or 10 seconds. The sun can move, the wind can pick back up again. So I have no control over exactly when that picture is going to be taken when I'm using a self-timer. With the remote release, I know when I hit the button, the picture is done, and that gives me more confidence as a photographer and increases my hit rate. So that's why I like using a remote release. But if you don't have one, the self-timer works. Just remember, if you're getting into telephoto territory, go with 10 second. Just do yourself that favor. Now, one final thing that we can talk about is going to be the shutter actuation. Most cameras nowadays have a fully mechanical shutter and they have a hybrid shutter where they can be electronically activated. So most, to my knowledge, are shipped with electric front curtain, which if you look at how this works, when the camera's getting ready to take a picture, and let's just say this frame right here is the sensor, there is a shutter that is covering this, so it's all black. When you hit the button, that front curtain rises and exposes the sensor. The second curtain follows behind and closes that again. Then it resets. Hit the button, shutter opens, second curtain closes. So this curtain, the shutter curtain itself, is a mechanical piece. So when you release the shutter using the remote, you're in live view, the mirror's out of the way, you're on a tripod, the neck strap is gone, your image stabilization is turned off, everything is tack sharp. That little bit of vibration from the shutter activating could potentially bring in some vibration. Electric front curtain eliminates that front curtain shutter, and it basically just energizes the sensor at the time the exposure starts, and then the second curtain closes. Second curtain comes through when the exposure is essentially done. The vibration is not going to affect. If you think it might, and you have the ability, go with full electric shutter. Both front and rear curtains are controlled electrically. Some cameras have that, but for the most part, electric first curtain works fine. That's just kind of that end result, best way of dealing with everything. All those little small bits and pieces have a lot to do with camera motion and therefore part of the blur in your image. The way to tell the difference is to look at your images, and if everything is equally blurry and you know that you have your focus set correctly, then that is going to be camera motion. Your shutter speed was not fast enough, you weren't on a tripod, image stabilization wasn't enough, something that we've talked about is at fault. If everything is sharp in your image as expected based on depth of field, but the subject that you know the focus was locked on is blurry, that's motion blur in your subject. Shutter speed is the only thing that's going to fix that, or telling your subject to stop moving. That doesn't work with cows, I've tried. So you just have to adjust the shutter speed to effectively freeze that motion. So we've gone through a lot of information here on how to make some tack sharp images and how to do it for essentially free. The only thing I think that we've talked about, short of the tripod, and the tripod is an investment. I think it's a worthwhile investment. But this right here, shutter release, I think this one was $50. Might not have even been that much. And it's the Canon piece. You can get third-party manufacturer ones for even cheaper. These are all free things that we can do to make our pictures more sharp, and assuming that you already have a tripod. Because if not, it does get expensive. And don't cheap out on a tripod. You don't want to cheap out on glass. You don't want to cheap out on a tripod, and you don't want to cheap out on any filters that you use. Pretty much anything else in photography, you can get away with a certain amount of being cheap. Those are areas I don't recommend that you save money in. Spend the money, get the stuff that's worthwhile. So I hope you have enjoyed this week's tips and tricks, and that you've learned something, and hopefully we've helped to get your images a little bit sharper. If you're still having issues and you happen to be here in the foothills of North Carolina in that area, I'm happy to come out and meet with you for some mentorship, and we can go through this and some other things to get your images sharper and to get those images the way that you want them. I'll leave a link to that in the description. But hopefully this has been beneficial, and let me know if you like this type of tips and tricks, because I'm about to run out of the image editing stuff, at least how I had it planned originally. So I'm looking for some other things that I can do to kind of move this forward. So let me know if this works. Don't forget to like and subscribe, And I will see you back here next week with another video. So until then, happy shooting, happy editing, and may all your images be sharp. Bye now.